Hello everyone, my name is James. This is my short video of this series about me making games as fast as I can. I've been working on this project like 2 hours. Right now, I'm in this point of the project. It's like Chapp, like you can shoot arrows. Edermunizz is working and the camera is working too well, in this video I'm going to process this is like
Everybody should do in their lifetime sometime two things. One is to consider death, to observe skulls and skeletons, and to wonder what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Never. That is a very gloomy thing for contemplation, but it's like manure. Just as manure fertilizes the plants and so on, so the contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creative life. You get wonderful things out of that. And the other thing to contemplate is to follow the possibility of the idea that you are totally selfish. That you don't have a good thing to be said for you at all. You're a complete, utter rascal. Now, when you go deeply into the nature of selfishness, what do you discover? You say, I love myself, I seek my own advantage. Now, what is the self that I love? What do I want? And that becomes an increasingly ever-deepening puzzle. Now, I've often referred to this when you say to somebody else, I love you. It's always rather disconcerting to the person to whom you say that. If you imply that you love them with a pure, disinterested, and holy love, they automatically suspect it as being a little bit phony. But if you say, I love you so much I could eat you, that's an expression, it's a way of saying to a person, you attract me so much that I can't help it. I'm absolutely bowled over by you. I'm gone. And people like that. Then they feel they're really being loved. It's absolutely genuine. But now, I love you so much I could eat you. Now what the devil do I want? I certainly don't want to eat the girl in the sense of literally devouring her, because then she'd disappear. But I love myself. And what is me? In what way do I know me? When it suddenly occurs to me that I know me only in terms of you. And that the main task of the psychotherapist is to do what he called to integrate the evil. To, as it were, put the devil in us in its proper function. Because you see, it's always the devil, the unacknowledged one, the outcast, the scapegoat, the bastard, the bad guy, you see, the black sheep of the family. It's always from that point that generation comes. In other words, in the same way as in the drama, to have the play, it's necessary to introduce a villain. It's necessary to introduce a certain element of trouble. So, in the whole scheme of life, there has to be the shadow. Because without the shadow, there can't be the substance. So this is why there is a very strange association between crime and all naughty things and holiness. You see, holiness is way beyond being good. Good people aren't necessarily holy people. A holy person is one who is whole, who has, as it were, reconciled his opposites. And so there's always something slightly scary about holy people. And other people react to them in very strange ways. They can't make up their minds whether they're saints or devils. And so holy people have throughout history always created a great deal of trouble, along with their creative results. Take Jesus, for example. Trouble that Jesus created is absolutely incalculable. Think of the Crusades, the Inquisition, heaven only knows what's gone on in the name of Jesus. Very remarkable. Freud's a big trouble. He only had a tremendous humor. And he knew that nobody can be completely honest. That you will try and you will have a great deal of success in exploring your motivations and your dark, unconscious depths. But there will be a certain point at which you will say, well, I've had enough of that. You know. And do you see how, in a strange way, there's a certain sanity in that? When a person indulges in a certain kind of duplicity, of deception, there is something, you all laughed when I said that, there was something humorous about it. And this humor is a very funny thing. Basically, humor is an attitude of laughter about oneself. There is malicious humor, which is laughing at other people. But real deep humor is laughter at oneself. Now, why fundamentally do you laugh about yourself? What makes you laugh about yourself? Isn't it because you know that there is a big difference between what goes on the outside and what goes on the inside? Now, I passed you around a lot of embroidery to look at before we started. And I'm perfectly sure that you got the point. That there's a big difference between the front and the back. In some forms of embroidery, the back is very different from the front because people take shortcuts. In the front, everything is orderly, and it is supposed to be kind of messy on the back side. See, which side will you wear? You've got to be sure you get the front in front, have the back in the back. The back has all the little tricks in it, all the shortcuts, all the lowdown that people don't acknowledge, see? And it's exactly the same with the way we live. You know, like sweeping the dust under the carpet in a hurry just before the guests come. I mean, we do ever so many things like that. And if you don't do it, if you don't think you do it, and you think, well, really, my embroidery is the same on both sides, see? Well, you're deceiving yourself. Because what you're doing is you're taking the shortcuts in another dimension, which you're keeping out of consciousness. Everybody takes the shortcuts. Everybody plays tricks. Everybody has in himself an element of duplicity, deception. Because you see, from this point of view that I'm discussing, where the web is the trap, to be is to deceive. Think of camouflage. A chameleon who changes its color. Think of the butterfly pretending it has eyes. Think of the flower saying to the bee, like my honey. Bee says, wow. But then that means that the bee has to be, and it has to go on living, and all the trouble it takes to go around collecting honey and raising other bees and organizing itself and doing that dance which tells the other bees where there's more honey. There's all that stuff to do. But the flower was deceptive. Now, in the same way I've often said, life is a drama, and a drama is a deception. It's a big act. When you peel an onion and you don't really understand the nature of an onion, you might look for the pit in the center, like any ordinary fruit has. But the onion doesn't have a center. It's all skins. So when you get right down, there's nothing but a bunch of skins. You say, well, that was kind of disappointing. Well, in rather the same way, you find when you explore yourself and your motivations, and you go through and through, and you try to find out that thing which is really genuine. So you explore the onion, and you go in and in and in, and then you find, well, it's all a deception. Now then the question arises, who's deceiving who? Who's fooling who? I'm fooling me? What is fooling? Fooling is playing like you're there when you're not. You know, getting somebody else to answer your name in the roll call. So, we're all, you see, this is the metaphysical basis of it. This is what the Hindus mean by Maya, the world illusion. The world is playing it's there when it isn't. And it's a trap. And it sucks you in. And you can't get out of it. And it's a thorough big trap too. But always, when you get an idea like this or a feeling like this, follow it to its extreme. Don't back out from it. If you find you're selfish, go to the extreme of what selfishness means. Confusion largely results from not following feelings or ideas to their depth. You know, people think they want to be immortal. They'd like to live forever. Do you really want to do that? Think about it. Really go into it, what it would be like. People say they want this, that, and the other. They want this kind of car, they want this kind of dress, or so on, this much money, and so on. It's always a good idea to think it right through. What it would involve to be in that situation, to have those desires fulfilled. Also, when you form a relationship to another person, think it through too. You see? How inconvenient would they be? However attractive. And always turn the embroidery round and look at the underside, but don't get caught doing it. See, that's something one does on the side in secret, because otherwise you play the game that everything is as it's supposed to be on the front. But that makes you humorous, and that makes you human.
Well, now you know that one of the great problems that has arisen out of the Western study of Indian philosophy, as well as out of the tradition of Western philosophy, in relation to the whole problem of illusion, is the question of what is called in the technical jargon of Western philosophy, subjective idealism. This is the theory that all reality is mental. And we have to start by making a clear distinction between subjective idealism and solipsism. Solipsism is the doctrine that you are the only person who exists, and everybody else is your dream. And you can see there's a certain analogy between that and the Hindu idea that all this cosmos is the dream of the Godhead. But the difference here is that in the solipsistic doctrine, it is just you, as you more or less know yourself from a conscious standpoint, as a finite individual, and not much more than that, having this dream that all these other people exist. There's no way of really producing an argument against solipsism, because you can always say to a solipsist, what evidence, if someone could produce it, would you regard as disproving your idea? That's a very disconcerting question to ask anybody, and I give it to you if ever you get involved in philosophical one-upmanship. Ask a Freudian, what evidence, if it could be brought forward, would you consider to disprove the Oedipus complex theory? You'll find he can't think of anything at all. Or ask a theologian, what evidence would you find conclusive as disproving the existence of God? And he can't think of anything. Whereas other people, if you ask them that question, will suggest an experiment and say, all right, if this experiment is negative, then we'll accept the evidence. And one of the classic experiments of this nature is the Michelson-Morley experiment, which disproved the existence of the ether, as at any rate in the form that people had conceived ether. And it's been generally accepted. Somebody thought out what would happen if there were really ether. So, this is always one of the problems of solipsism, and we're going to see it's one of the problems of subjective idealism. But the difference between solipsism and subjective idealism is contained in the famous double limerick. There was a young man who said, God, I find it exceedingly odd that a tree as a tree simply ceases to be when there's no one around in the quad. And the reply, young man, your astonishment's odd. I'm always around in the quad, so the tree as a tree never ceases to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. The great subjective idealists in the tradition of Western philosophy are, of course, Berkeley, the bishop, and Bradley. Bradley. And it's in some ways difficult to make out exactly what they were saying when they said that everything is in the mind, because they could never say clearly what they meant by the mind. But if you will be a little naive for a moment and seem at least to understand what you mean when you use the word mind, they will pitch the argument in the following way. You do not know anything except in your own mind. The whole existence of an external world is something known to you in your mind. The distance of other people and other objects from you is a distance that exists in the mind. You cannot possibly conceive any world existing unless it be an experience. How could there be an unexperienced world? That would not be a world for anyone or anything. Therefore, it would not be at all, because being is always being for something. It is, in other words, relational. The sun is light for eyes. Eyes are organs of vision for a mind. If there are no eyes, the sun gives forth no light. If there are no nerve ends, it gives forth no heat. If there are no muscles, nothing is heavy. And if there are no soft skins, nothing is hard. Because it's only in relation to a certain softness that something hard can be said to be hard. Only in relation to a certain degree of measurement performed by the neurons that things can be said to be relatively hot or cold. Hot and cold are the impact of energies on a nervous system. Energies at all are recognized as energies by their impact on something. So the Zen poem says, the tree manifests the spiritual power of the wind, the water, the miraculous energy of the moon. So the tree is waving. And we wouldn't know there was any wind around, you see, unless there were a tree or something like it to wave in it. And in the same way as the moon, when the water ripples, breaks up into 1,000 fragments and shimmers all over the place, you see, we wouldn't know that the moon had this miraculous power to duplicate itself, to triplicate, quadruplicate, multimillionaire itself, were it not for the water. So these are the foundations of the idealist theory. You must distinguish between philosophical idealism and ethical idealism. They're two totally unrelated ideas. Philosophical idealism means that only the ideal world is the real world, that is to say, the world in the mind. Now, the theory is incredibly plausible, as it has been stated by people like Berkeley and Bradley and the Western idealists. But today it is about the most unfashionable philosophical theory in the academic world that you can follow. Because Western philosophy has undergone a great revolution since about 1914. In that year, there was published Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And Wittgenstein came from the so-called Vienna school, or was influenced by the Vienna school, of people who call themselves scientific empiricists, sometimes logical analysts, sometimes logical philosophers. And they said, only statements that are this empirically verifiable have meaning. They never verified that statement, but that was their point of departure. That's their basic assumption. Everybody has a metaphysical assumption you can't prove. Watch out. Basic to all thought. For example, you must be consistent. Try it. But at any rate, this school has had immense influence in the 20th century. And it argues, basically, that in order to say something meaningful, he's having fun. Huh? You must be able to verify, that is to say, to verify things, but if you make a prediction based on your statement, and it comes true, you verify it. If it doesn't come true, you haven't verified it, you de-verify it. A statement which was de-verified, shown to be untrue, might be meaningful, but untrue. But a statement that you can't think any way of verifying it is in this theory meaningless. Now, so you say, the world is ruled by God. Everything that happens, happens under the governance of God. So the logical analyst says, you've made a statement now that says everything is affected by X, God. Suggest a way of verifying this. What difference would it make if it weren't so? Would it make any difference to the way things are going on if they weren't governed by God? This is a problem because it's just the same as if you had said, all bodies whatsoever in the universe, that includes all stars, all galaxies, all planets, are moving in a certain direction. Now, there's no way of verifying this because you can only verify movement in a certain direction by comparison with something that's relatively still. But there will not be any still body with reference to which all the other bodies move, because you said in the beginning all bodies in the universe are moving in such and such a direction. So you could only say everything in the universe is governed by God if you made an exception. But there are certain things that are not. You see? Then, according to logical analysis, you could have made a meaningful statement. But when you start making statements about everything, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it. And so they say, although you think you have said something, you haven't really said anything at all. You made a statement that was actually as nonsensical as asking why is a mouse when it spins. But this statement about God doing or ruling all things sounded meaningful because we're used to it, but is really pure nonsense. This has been so persuasive in the climate of academic philosophy today that idealism of all kinds is, as I said, extremely unfashionable. But there are considerations that might cause us to reflect on this more carefully. Because we can think of situations analogous to the idea that all things are ruled by God, or all things exist only in the mind. There are situations analogous to that in our everyday experience. Only we can be aware of these situations because we stand outside them. Now, first of all, consider a mirror. A mirror will reflect all kinds of shapes and colors. And when you look at the mirror itself will be the ground or the underlying element common to all those shapes and colors. And it is not meaningless to say that they are all reflections in a mirror, because the mirror has an edge, and you can see other things around the mirror which behave in a different way from the reflections. You can't put your hand out and pull the necktie of a reflection in the mirror. But you can reach your hand out and pull the necktie of somebody standing beside the mirror. See? But nevertheless, within the context of the mirror, all the things that are there are reflected in it. And if the mirror weren't there, they wouldn't be there, those reflections. Now, supposing similarly, everything that exists has its being in a mirror called the mind. Only, there is no way of seeing the edge of this mirror. Is that meaningful? Is that possible? The positivists, the logical analysts will say no, because the statement makes no difference to anything. It makes no difference to anything in this thing you call the mind, that it's in the mind. It makes no difference to anything in the mirror, that it's in the mirror. For example, your face is not immediately changed by being reflected in a mirror. The mirror doesn't exercise influences, or so they say, upon the reflections, but it very well could. Let's consider what we were discussing last night. Lenses in cameras influence the kind of world they photograph. A convex lens will give you one thing, a concave lens will give you another thing. And one can think of all sorts of wonky lenses, prismatic lenses, bent lenses, squirrely lenses. Now you see, if the lenses of your eyes could be said to distort the physical world, you would take that distortion as normal, because there'd be no way of setting up a standard and saying, by that standard my eyes are wrong, unless you simply took some other kind of a lens and said, this is right, and the eye is distorted. You would have always seen things that way. So, nevertheless, whether the eyes are distorted or not distorted is impossible to decide. So, according to this way of logic, that is a meaningless question. There is no way of deciding the answer, and it makes no difference whether it is or whether it isn't, or so they say. But I think that they have neglected certain kinds of difference that these things do make. First of all, there is a difference of feeling and very often a difference in behavior between a person who is aware of an underlying ground or continuum for every experience and every reality, and a person who is not aware of it. The person who's aware of it feels at home in his surroundings. The person who's not aware of it doesn't. The first belongs, and the second doesn't feel he belongs. He feels he's engaged in a contest. Furthermore, one of the difficult ideas to get across and express well in any language which wants to assert a pluralistic universe in which there is no unifying ground. Any language based on that assumption is going to have difficulty talking about relationships. Let's go back in the history of philosophy and look at former instances of this difficulty. The thing that really bogged Descartes down and that puzzled him, he never could answer, was the relationship of mind and matter, or spirit and matter. He had inherited from Platonism and from Christianity the theory of the two worlds, the natural and the supernatural, the material and the mental, the real and the ideal. And what never could be explained by the philosophies of the people who believe that way was how the one influenced the other. How does the spiritual world influence the material? As is well known, all ghosts, all good, well-behaved ghosts, walk straight through walls without budging a brick. Now, if my mind is my ghost within me, how on earth does it lift my arm? When a ghost doesn't budge a brick when it walks through a wall. See, this is the real problem. It all sunk on this. They couldn't explain that. as the Cartesian cannot explain the influence of mind on matter, so a person who works according to the theories of logical analysis can't really explain relationship between so-called things. If he's going to take a pluralistic theory of the universe, in which there is no unifying continuum, but there are just these events, you see, there are these things we can talk about in a scientific descriptive manner. How are they related? They obviously are related. They obviously influence each other. But how? Put it in another way of historical philosophical problem. How does a cause influence an effect? Kind of amazing, you know, that they do. We say there are causes and effects. But how does a cause lead to an effect? Is it something like a row of dominoes that stand on their end? You flip down the first one and they go clickety, 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 clickety and all knock each other down. Or a row of billiard balls, that's the idea of Newtonian physics, of course. That's the atoms. It's like billiard balls and they bang each other around. So you've got results. But this really won't do. Because there's any means. One is, of course, that things influence each other backwards. A future event can change a past event. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but it can. If I say, the bark of the dog, the bark of the tree, what happens to bark, the former event, is very seriously influenced by the later event, dog or tree. Although the word sounds the same and is spelled the same, it has a different meaning according to what happens later. So in the same way in music, what is happening at this moment may be changed altogether by something happening later. A note has one meaning in one context, another meaning in another context. So what is the cause-effect relationship between them when apparently the earlier event seems to be causally affected by the later event? You see how puzzling all that is. But it's very easily illustrated by certain phenomena of music. When a person is tone deaf, that is to say he cannot hear melodies, he only hears noise, and he can't understand why other people find music attractive. What is his deficiency? Where is he blind? His blindness is that he cannot hear relationships, or rather, in musical language, he doesn't hear intervals. If you are musically sensitive, what you hear in a melody is not a string of notes. You hear the steps between them. You recognize the major scale of C as ascending. Why do we think of that as up? What does it mean that one sound is higher than another? That's nonsense to a person who's tone deaf. There are just different sounds. There are boomy sounds and squeaky sounds, but they don't rise. You see, he hears no motion because you see, each note is static, and he doesn't hear the lead from one to the other, the step. Also, a person who's a logical positivist, this is a tone-deaf philosopher. See? And you can't explain, there's nothing you can do to a tone-deaf person to explain how you hear music, just as there's absolutely no way of making a congenitally blind person understand color. Or we may find out one eventually when we find out a lot more about our senses. But in the ordinary way, he just can't get it. And so in exactly that same way, there are people who cannot get certain things. You say of such people, you know all the words, but you don't know the music. And you may as not waste your energies trying to convince, but there are a lot of these poor, afflicted souls who just aren't functioning on a certain way of that. But now I don't want to say, make a kind of a esoteric scene out of this. A lot of people are trained to pretend that they are not on that wavelength. You may be perfectly capable of understanding the relationship between a cause and effect. You know what the relationship is? Very simple. They're the same event, only divided into two parts. If you see a cat walk by a very narrow window, you see first the head and a little later the tail. If you speak in cumbersome philosophical language, you're going to start talking about the event head being the cause of the event tail. Well, it's all one cat. And that's it. So when you see causes and effects, what you're saying is this. Aha, I realize at last my perception is limited. And when I saw one thing that's invariably followed by something else, what I hadn't noticed is that they're continuous with each other. So that when one part of this pattern arises, I should expect the other part. They're one pattern. They're not cause and effect. They're not something that is an action and a response to that action, an action and a reaction. They're a single action. That's why they're related this way. All right, so I've got these two discrete events, and I call them cause and effect. But I find they are really one. Okay, in exactly the same way, I've got the two discrete events, you and I. We could equally well conclude to say that the latent content and the day are one. Or the organism and the environment. Becoming plainer and plainer. That they are one. Now what this goes back to, again we are looking at philosophical history, is the Western debate between the two schools of thought called the nominalists and the realists. And the modern logical philosophers are nominalists. Now, their fight is as follows. The realists say there are real, this is how they get the word realist. It's not what we call a realist today at all. It's quite different. The realist says there are, in reality, substances which could be called matter, or spirit, or humanity, just to take an example. Every individual human being is an instance of something called mankind. And mankind is a real entity. Say, too, the United States of America is a real entity. And all these individual examples of it are, as it were, members of the body constituted by the real mankind, or the state, or the society, or the church, or the whatever. In contradistinction, the nominalist says, all your so-called real natures are abstractions. There is no such thing as mankind. There are simply these individual people. And calling them all men is a way of identifying them, but there is no such thing as mankind. In the same way, there is no such thing as the United States. There are all these people living here who imagine that they're the United States and call themselves that. But the United States as such has no physical existence, because when you say the policy of the United States towards Russia is thus and so, you don't mean the policy of the geographical territory. And nominalism, you see, is a very big thing for the followers of Korzybski and for all logical analysts and so on, because they take the point of view. The whole thing in Korzybski is that you mustn't just go around calling things dogs, but you must recognize that it's Fido sub 1, Fido sub 2, and Fido sub 3. And so this helps you, the song says, to see each doggy differently. So the idea in semantics is this tremendous precise accuracy of getting the details, seeing that not every colored man is a nigger, not every Chinese is a chink, not every Italian is a wop. See? Now, of course, yes, there's the richness of detail, but these are philosophical fashions that go back and forth between the prickly-minded people and the gooey-minded people. The prickly-minded people are the nominalists, and they like to emphasize the details, the atomic, discontinuous structure of things. The gooey-minded people like to emphasize the great connected generalities. The way things form into bodies. But you see very clearly what happens if you press nominalism to its logical conclusion. The answer is there are no people. There are only amalgamations of cells. What you really are these cells. Or you want to go further, say what you are is only these electrons. That's all there is, you see. And this idea that they add up in some way to a person is just an abstraction. You're not really there, you see, they're just all that. Now, wait a minute, Mr. Nominalist. Suddenly, you are beginning to turn into a believer in Maya. What's your step, you see? If you push anybody far enough philosophically, they all arrive at the same place. You suddenly tell me you don't believe human beings really exist. There are only these atoms. Well, well, well. So I suppose we can argue the same thing about connections in time. Melody is then an illusion. There are only the individual notes. After all, if you're going to be a nominalist, then melody is something that just doesn't exist at all. Okay. Now, that's almost what the Buddhists say. When I was explaining to you this morning, the moment, you don't connect the moments, there's only one moment, you know, the thing. Well, that's the same thing the same way. I'm saying that all the connections are an illusion. So, the only, push your nominalist right into the corner. Say, the only things that exist are the multiplicity of atoms. And actually, they only exist now. See, because only can't even say it. Only this moment is real. It's the ultimate hairline. See? That's why the precisionists make you watch it. That has hairlines narrower, 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 narrower. They can only be seen by amazing microscopes. Exactly. They want to know when does that thing cross that thing point. See? So eventually they're going to get down, down, down. And the universe has no time to exist it. Therefore it doesn't exist. Therefore it's an illusion. That was what Dr. Zeno, when he got the paradox of motion. Now either an arrow is somewhere or it isn't. If it's moving, it isn't anywhere. But it's obvious if it isn't anywhere, it couldn't exist. You know, I kind of think it's the same problem as Achilles and the tortoise. Manifestly, the Achilles in a race overtakes the tortoise. But you can talk about this race in such a way that he can't. How do you do the trick? What you do is this. Although Achilles in the physical world overtakes the tortoise, in the intellectual world, which you are using to measure the process, you measure his approach to the tortoise by a narrower and narrower scale as he approaches the tortoise. Although he runs right by it, your measuring process gets more and more minute. You take longer and longer to think about it, because you're counting more units. that you can indefinitely subdivide the distance between parts approaching the source. And you can go on talking about their subdivisions forever, so that in terms of your talking, you never get by the talk. As you're drawing the lines finer and finer and finer and finer and finer. So now who's making the abstractions? The nominalist is telling the realist, you're making the abstractions. You're talking about these vast generalities called humanity and America. But now who's making the abstractions? I thought you were the prickly fellow who was so precise and said only these specific, particular details exist. You see? But he disappears into abstraction. So the pot calls the kettle black. So you see, that fight goes out the window. Because they both, if you push them far enough, they come back to each other. Push a realist far enough, and he comes into a nominalist. Push a nominalist far enough, and he turns into a realist. What does that mean? Well, it means the same thing as if you investigate matter thoroughly, you turn up with mind. If you investigate mind thoroughly, you turn up with matter. If you investigate yourself, what do you mean by you? How do you know you exist? In terms of what? What do you discover? If you push that, why you discover everything else that you thought possible. You only know you exist because you've got things to feel and other people to talk to, and because you go yeah, you reflect the external world. So investigate you and you get the external world. Now what happens if you investigate the external world? Well, you get you. That's what happens, you see, when finally the physicists want to know, how are things like when they're not looking at them? That's the great question. You see, in order to see how electrons behave, I've got to put them in a process of their behavior. I'm really bombarding electrons with electrons. Now what is the electron doing when I'm not looking at it? Does the light really go up? So you find, you see, that knowing, the act of knowing, changes what you are. Knowledge of something is the same as action upon it. You do not know the laws of rubber and plastic. That acts upon the law. That's so with everything. All knowing is not something you merely are a passive spectator. All knowing is the result of experiments on things. Only in the most trivial instances are you ever, and even then if you go into the neurology of it, the electronics of it, you're not a passive spectator. You may just observe things and write them down. Although when you do, it's pretty trivial. The really good knowledge is always accumulated by an action upon the world to see what changes that action makes. So, for example, we take certain fields of science. Let's take medicine and antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are something, first of all, done in very carefully experiments. They were found very useful, so they were spread over the social world, so that almost everybody has had antibiotics by now. But the problem now arises is this: the people as we studied them before they ever had antibiotics were different from the people we are studying now who have them. So what we knew about people before antibiotics has a little less value. We've got to restudy them every time because we've changed them. And the insects, the germs, also adapted. They say, no, human beings throwing down all this jazz, confusing us, killing us off, we've got to do something about that. And so they change themselves. So they have to be studied again to know how to attack them the next time. Once upon a time, a spaceship arrived on a strange planet. And they came down, didn't seem to be anything living on it. And they put a lot of stores in. And finally they found that some little bugs were eating the grain that they had stored. So they got insecticides and fixed those bugs. Later they found they had mice. And they were nibbling up things, so they got some cats sent on the next spaceship from Earth. The cats took care of the mice. Then lo and behold, dogs turned up, started making trouble for the cats. So they decided that they'd better shoot the dogs. They did. And one day they saw suddenly a man coming over the horizon with a gun. And they said to the chief, "Look at that, there's people on this planet after all, and he's got a gun. Should we shoot him?" He said, "No, because I have no way of knowing what it will turn up as the next time." Well, now look here. What I've been trying to show is that you cannot use the language of illusion, that is to say, the language of accurate, separative description, too far without getting into confusion. Push your nominal, and it becomes real. Push your scientific materialism, and it turns into mystery. I loved it. That's great fun. I gave a lecture at Harvard then some time ago on B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner is the arch creativist. He is Mr. Mechanism Psychology. And I took many passages from his work and said, now just see what he's really saying and so on. He's a mystic. He really believes in the unity of the universe and all that jazz. You see, that the individual organism is a function of the cosmos. And if I say that, you see, I say he's a mystic, does this ruin his scientific reputation? What does it do? But that, you see, that's the great game to play. Just push it along its logical line, and you arrive up. One way or the other, it really doesn't matter which way you do it. It either shows nothing exists at all on the earth, or else that it's all one. So, in this way then, we have to resolve the problem of mind and matter by what I referred to this morning, looking at these as dimensions of each other. nothing at all is a statement of the same kind as when a logical positivist says, in making your metaphysical assertion, you said nothing at all. And if you are Zen, you say, correct. I entirely agree with you. And yet, you see, that nothing at all was all in all. That was the thing. That was the big thing. You know, you lost everything and gained everything in one fell swoop. As having nothing but possessing all things. Because obviously, you see, if the mirror weren't there, the images wouldn't be. There'd be no connection between them. They couldn't jump together. If the water weren't there, how would the Pidgeon Sprites get around? The air weren't there, how would the bird be around? Consciousness weren't there, how would experience occur? See? If being weren't there, how could there be being? So there are water, air, to the bird, consciousness to man, and enlightenment. That would say to the English sense that melody is inconceivable to the tone deaf person. The same way that color is inconceivable to the blind man, sound, deafness. I was discussing the plausibility of two essential features of the positive illusion. The question that we have to decide whether to take life seriously or not, that is to say, whether the plot is funny or tragic. And if it's tragic, you see, must we say that it's ultimately tragic? And the question of who are you? And are we to say that I myself, right down the root, am just a little kind that really has nothing to do with cosmos, but just arise in it and live here on sufferance for a short period and then absolutely nothing follows, you see. Or the alternative to that is what I really am. Same as the whole thing, that is, the works, the it, or whatever you want to call it, Brahman, God, the Tao, the great void, the Buddha nature, I don't care, the self, anything, any name you want. And whereas that attitude, you can look at it from various points of view in judging it. You can say it's wishful thinking. You can say that it's insufferable pride. But the point of the matter is, as I tried to show, any other way of looking at things is kind of schizoid. It looks at human beings as if they arrived in this world like a bunch of birds on the branches of a barren tree. They just got settled there, you know, they don't belong. The sense of being strangers and pilgrims from another domain altogether. Well, where is this other domain? And how does it relate to this one? Are they separate? I showed you that even when we say that two domains are the poles apart, the very fact that they're poles shows that they have a hidden connection. And the hidden connection is the big thing in life. All you junkies know that. And so, in other words, we get a pattern of organization that is radial. Together out of the infinite wastes of space and sort of began them, whereas the other pattern, which is so much more sensible, and I showed you how the crystals and the stars and the octopuses and even the human beings are all radial structures. Of course, we don't see our radial relationship to the totality of the universe because it isn't obvious. It's obvious that a tree is an arm of the earth reaching up and waving at the sky. And a mountain is another kind of radiation from the earth. And so is a leg from a body, and hair, and things like that. But what makes human beings, as the highest of the mammals, so conscious of being independent is that they are topologically an enclosed surface, you see, which wanders around independently of the ground. What we don't notice is that we are not independent of the ground at all, that wandering around is something that is entirely related to there being some ground. In other words, when you run up a hill, the hill also runs you up it. The hill rises and lifts you as you run, see? And if you understand that, you don't take a hostile attitude to mountains and hills. You're grateful to them for lifting you up so high in the air, because that's presumably why you went up, that the thing was high. It was lifted up. You wanted to be lifted up. It lifted you up. You had to cooperate, of course. I always like the illustration that I've used before, perhaps you haven't heard it, of the thistledown. The thistledown, too, comes moving through the sky. I once was playing with the thing, and it just came out of the blue sky, and it caught it like that. Pulled it under my nose, and it started to pull to get away. It looked as if it were a butterfly or something. It pulled away when you catch it by the leg. And I thought, oh no, of course, that's not the thistledown, it's the wind. Well, which was it? You know, in the famous debate that was settled by the sixth patriarch of Zen, there were two monks arguing when a flag was flapping in the wind, whether it was the wind or the flag that was moving. And he said, it's neither, it's the mind. And so in a way, the same thing was true about the thistledown. The mind is the moving thing, because which point of view would you take, which attitude of mind would you take towards this? Is it the wind moving the thistledown? Or is it the thistledown that is moving itself with the wind? After all, when you see a sailing boat, there's a man in the sailing boat. Who is moving the boat? Is the wind moving the boat? Or is the man moving the boat because he was smart enough to put up a sail? Much smarter way of getting around than rowing. You don't have to work. It's intelligence. See, the mind moves the boat. And so in the same way, I thought, you know, this thistledown is some kind of intelligence. It's radial, it's organized, it's beautiful. And it's used that to sail itself with the wind, to enable itself to pull like a little organism playing with the wind. And so in just the same way, each one of us uses the universe to get around. And the universe uses us to play with and to make games and patterns and to do its stuff. So because we seem to be disconnected and entirely sealed within our skin, that is a very deceptive thing, because the skin is not really the boundary of man. You'll notice that in various periods of art, human beings have been shaped in different ways and have been more or less transparent at some times, at other times opaque, and sometimes the emphasis has been on the state of mind which this human being is in. At other times, the emphasis is on the bodily conformations and so on. In the work of painters today, one sees images that at first sight one doesn't recognize as being human. There was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York some years ago called The New Image of Man. And these things didn't look like human beings at all. Some of them did, but then that depends on your point of view. resemblance to what we recognize as the human image. Look at a spermatozoa under a microscope, that little tadpole. And how can that have any connection with a grown human being? It's so unlike, you see. It's foreign feeling. And you get the creep sometimes, the foreign feeling about yourself, if you feel your own pulse. Or if you're able to look at an X-ray in some way of your inner organs working. See, they're all strangers we don't know about. They give us the creep, as if they were, coming across weird insects in the dark. And that sort of feeling. But what we will always find out in the end, when we meet the very strange thing, and we look into the distant reaches of space, there will one day be the dawning recognition that why that's me. And the whole game of the universe, you see, is to appear as strange to itself as one can. That's how one keeps variety going. That's how one keeps wonder going. And all kinds of exciting developments. How different can you get? In the beginning, the Lord said, get lost to himself, you see. So, we shall find, for example, that space that you see all around you and containing you. And you can feel space in many ways. Space is not only something that comes through the eyes. The movement of your arms, if with closed eyes, for a blind person, is his way of knowing space. And you can hear space audibly. Lots of sounds appear to be in restricted spaces or ample spaces. And silence that goes with sound corresponds to space. And even St. Thomas Aquinas, that old Catholic theologian, said that good derives its virtue from evil, just as it is the silent pause that gives sweetness to the chant. So, but space, you see, that seems to contain, space is one's mind. This was common sense to people living in the early Renaissance, for example, at the time of Dante. There are many references in Dante's poetry to the identity of mind and space. And likewise in the 8th century text in China, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, he likens the nature of mind to the nature of space. He says just as space contains all the sun and the moon and the stars and the people and the mountains and the forests, so the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of oneself contains all these things. So you see that if you think that way, you have an image of man that is global, that is very different from the image in which man is defined as bounded by his skin. That's a prejudice. We think now, for example, I have my own private thoughts. Well, nobody has private thoughts. Because one thinks in images and words, and these words and images are derived from the whole thought structure of the society in which you live. We think thoughts. The domain of mind is very similar to the grid structure of an electric power supply system. You know what happens is there's a network of power stations and transformers so arranged that if one of them gives out and fails to supply a certain area, immediately the grid connects them with other sources of power. Well, in rather a similar way, our minds are connected.
Okay, so
let's take one very obvious example of it.
What's a total success?
What's
an intense?
Northrop Frye calls the order of words. The order of words, all existing literature